Section 38 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 2, African Explorers, B. The loss of Houghton's journals, containing the observations made during his journey, deprived science of the result of all his fatigue and devotion. To ascertain what he accomplished, one must have recourse to the proceedings of the African Society. At this time Mungo Park, a young Scottish surgeon, who had just returned from a voyage to the East Indies on board of the Worcester, learned that the African Society were anxious to find an explorer willing to penetrate to the interior of the country watered by the Gambia. Mungo Park, who had long wished to acquaint himself with the productions of the country and the manners and customs of the inhabitants, offered his services. He was not deterred by the apprehensions that his predecessor, Houghton, had probably perished. At once accepted by the Society, Mungo Park hastened his preparations and left Portsmouth upon the 22nd of May, 1795. He was furnished with introductions to Dr. Laidley and a credit of £200 sterling. Landing at Gillifree, at the mouth of the Gambia, in the kingdom of Barra, and following the river, he reached Pisania, an English factory belonging to Dr. Laidley. He directed his attention first to acquiring a knowledge of the Mandingo language, which was most generally used, and in collecting the facts most likely to be useful in the execution of his plans. His stay here enabled him to obtain more accurate information than his predecessors with regard to the Feloops, the Yolofs, the Fulahs, and the Mandingos. The Feloops are morose, quarrelsome, and vindictive, but faithful and courageous. The Yolofs are a powerful and warlike nation, with very black skins. Except in color and speech, they resemble the Mandingos, who are gentle and sociable. Tall and well made, their women are, comparatively speaking, pretty. Lastly, the Fulahs, who are the lightest in color, seem much attached to a pastoral and agricultural life. The greater part of these populations are Mahomedans, and practice polygamy. Upon the 2nd of December, Mungo Park, accompanied by 2 negro interpreters, and with a small quantity of baggage, started for the interior. He first reached the small kingdom of Woolli, the capital of which, Medina, comprises 1,000 houses. He then proceeded to Kolor, a considerable town, and, after 2 days' march across the desert, entered the kingdom of Bondu. The natives are Fulahs, professing the Mahomedan religion. They carry on a brisk trade in ivory when they are not engaged in agriculture. The traveller soon reached the Faleme River, the bed of which, near its source in the mountain of Dalaba, is very auriferous. He was received by the king at Fataconda, the capital of Bondu, and had great difficulty in convincing him that he travelled from curiosity. His interview with the wives of the monarch is thus described. Mungo Park says, "I had scarcely entered the court when I was surrounded by the entire seraglio. Some begged me for physic, some for amber, and all were most desirous of trying the great African specific of bloodletting. They are 10 or 12 in number, most of them young and handsome, wearing on their heads ornaments of gold or pieces of amber. They rallied me a good deal upon different subjects, particularly upon the whiteness of my skin and the length of my nose. They insisted that both were artificial. The first, they said, was produced when I was an infant, by dipping me in milk, and they insisted that my nose has been pinched every day till it had acquired its present unsightly and unnatural conformation." Leaving Bondu by the north, Mungo Park entered Kajaga, called by the French Galam. The climate of this picturesque country, watered by the Senegal, is far healthier than that of districts nearer the coast. The natives call themselves Serawulis, and are called Seracolets by the French. The color of their skin is jet black, and in this respect they are scarcely distinguishable from the Yolofs. Mungo Park says, "The Serawulis are habitually a trading people. They formerly carried on a great commerce with the French in gold dust and slaves, and still often supply the British factories on the Gambia with slaves. They are famous for the skill and honesty with which they do business. At Joac, Mungo Park was relieved of half his property by the envoys of the king, under pretence of making him pay for the right to pass through his kingdom. Fortunately for him, the nephew of Demba Jego Jalla, king of Kasson, who was about to return to his country, took him under his protection. They reached Gongadi, where there are extensive date plantations, together, and thence proceeded to Samia, on the shores of the Senegal, on the frontiers of Kasson. The first town met with in this kingdom was that of Tisi, which was reached by Mungo Park on the 31st of December. Well received by the natives, who sold him the provisions he needed at a reasonable price, the traveller was subjected by the brother and nephew of the king to endless indignities. Leaving this town upon the 10th of January, 1796, Mungo Park reached Kuniakari, the capital of Kasson, a fertile, rich, and well-populated country, which can place 40,000 men under arms. The king, full of kindly feeling for the traveller, wished him to remain in his kingdom as long as the wars between Kasson and Kajaga lasted. It was more than probable that the countries of Karta and Bambara, which Mungo Park wished to visit, would be drawn into it. The advice of the king to remain was prudent, and Park had soon reason enough to regret not having followed it. But, impatient to reach the interior, the traveller would not listen, and entered the level and sandy plains of Karta. He met crowds of natives on the journey, who were flying to Kasson to escape the horrors of war. But even this did not deter him. He continued his journey until he reached the capital of Karta, which is situated in a fertile and open plain. He was kindly received by the king, Daisy Kurabari, who endeavoured to dissuade him from entering Bambara, and, finding all his arguments useless, advised him to avoid passing through the midst of the fray by entering the kingdom of Ludamar, inhabited by Moors. From thence he could proceed to Bambara. During his journey, Mungo Park noticed negroes who fed principally upon a sort of bread made from the berries of the lotus, which tasted not unlike gingerbread. This plant, the Rhamnus lotus, is indigenous in Senegambia, Nigritia, and Tunis. So, says Mungo Park, there can be little doubt of this fruit being the lotus mentioned by Pliny as the food of the Libyan Lotophagi. I have tasted lotus bread, and think that an army may very easily have been fed with it, as is said by Pliny to have been done in Libya. The taste of the bread is so sweet and agreeable that the soldiers would not be likely to complain of it. On the 22nd of February, Mungo Park reached Jarra, a considerable town with houses built of stone, inhabited by negroes from the south who had placed themselves under the protection of the Moors, to whom they paid considerable tribute. From Ali, king of Ludamar, the traveller obtained permission to travel in safety through his dominions. But in spite of this safe conduct, Park was almost entirely despoiled by the fanatical Moors of Djenné. At Sampaka and Dalli, large towns, and at Samea, a small village pleasantly situated, he was so cordially welcomed that he already saw himself in fancy arrived in the interior of Africa, when a troop of soldiers appeared, who led him to Benown, the camp of King Ali. Ali, says Mungo Park, was sitting upon a black morocco cushion, clipping a few hairs on his upper lip, a female attendant holding a looking-glass before him. He was an old man of Arab race, with a long white beard, and he looked sullen and angry. He surveyed me with attention, and inquired of the Moors if I could speak Arabic. Being answered in the negative, he appeared surprised, and continued silent. The surrounding attendants, and especially ladies, were much more inquisitive. They asked 1,000 questions, inspected every part of my apparel, searched my pockets, and obliged me to unbutton my waistcoat to display the whiteness of my skin. They even counted my toes and fingers, as if they doubted whether I was in truth a human being. As unprotected stranger, a Christian, and accounted a spy, Mungo Park was a victim to the insolence, ferocity, and fanaticism of the Moors. He was spared neither insults, outrages, nor blows. They attempted to make a barber of him, but his awkwardness in cutting the hairy face of the king's son exempted him from this degrading occupation. During his captivity he collected many particulars regarding Timbuktu, which is so difficult of access to Europeans, and was the bourne of all early African explorers. Hausa, the sheriff told him, is the largest town I have ever seen. Walet is larger than Timbuktu, but as it is farther from the Niger, and its principal trade is in salt, few strangers are met there. From Benaun to Walet is a distance of 6 days' journey. No important town is passed between the two, and the traveller depends for sustenance upon the milk procurable from Arabs, whose flocks and herds graze about the wells and springs. The road leads for 2 days through a sandy desert, where not a drop of water is to be had. It takes 11 days to go from Walet to Timbuktu, but water is not so scarce on this journey, which is generally made upon oxen. At Timbuktu there are a number of Jews who speak Arabic, and use the same forms of prayer as the Moors. The events of the war decided Ali to proceed to Jarrah. Mungo Park, who had succeeded in making friends with the sultan's favorite, Fatima, obtained permission to accompany the king. The traveller hoped, by nearing the scene of action, to manage to escape. As it happened, the king of Karta, Daisy Kurabari, soon after marched against the town of Jarrah. The larger number of inhabitants fled, and Mungo Park did the same. He soon found means to get away, but his interpreter refused to accompany him. He was forced to start for Bambara alone and destitute of resources. The first town he came to was Waura, which properly belongs to Karta, but was then paying tribute to Mansong, king of Bambara. Mungo Park says, "Upon the morning of the 7th of July, as I was about to depart, my landlord, with a great deal of diffidence, begged me to give him a lock of my hair. He had been told, he said, that white man's hair made a safik (talisman) that would give the possessor all the knowledge of the white man. I had never before heard of so simple a mode of education, but I at once complied with the request, and my landlord's thirst for learning was so great that he cut and pulled at my hair till he had cropped one side of my head pretty closely, and would have done the same with the other, had I not signified my disapprobation, assuring him that I wished to reserve some of this precious material for a future occasion. First Galon, and then Murja, a large town, famous for its trade in salt, were passed, after fatigues and incredible privations. Upon nearing Sego, Mungo Park at last perceived the Djoliba. Looking forward, he says, I saw, with infinite pleasure, the great object of my mission, the long sought for majestic Niger, glittering in the morning sun, as broad as the Thames at Westminster, and flowing slowly to the eastward. I hastened to the brink, and, having drunk of the water, lifted up my fervent thanks in prayer to the great ruler of all things for having thus far crowned my endeavors with success. The fact of the Niger flowing towards the east did not, however, excite my surprise, for although I had left Europe in great hesitation on this subject, and rather believed it ran in the contrary direction, I had made frequent inquiries during my progress, and had received from negroes of different nations such clear and decisive assurances that its course was towards the rising sun, as scarce left any doubt in my mind, more especially as I knew that Major Houghton had collected similar information in a similar manner. Sego, the capital of Bambara, at which I had now arrived, consists, properly speaking, of 4 distinct towns, 2 on the northern bank of the river, called Sego Korro and Sego Boo, and 2 on the southern bank, called Sego Sou Korro and Sego Si Korro. They are all surrounded with high mud walls. The houses are built of clay, of a square form, with flat roofs. Some of them have 2 stories, and many of them are whitewashed. Besides these buildings, Moorish mosques are seen in every quarter, and the streets, though narrow, are broad enough for every practical purpose in a country where wheel carriages are unknown. From the best information I could obtain, I have reasons to believe that Sego contains altogether about 30,000 inhabitants. The king of Bambara resides permanently at Sego Se Korro. He employs a great many slaves in conveying people over the river, and the money they take, though the fare is only 10 cowries for each person, furnishes a considerable revenue to the king in the course of a year. By advice of the Moors, the king refused to receive the traveller, and forbade him to remain in his capital, where he could not have protected him from ill treatment. However, to divest his refusal of all appearance of ill will, he sent him a bag containing 5,000 cowries, of the value of about £1 sterling, to buy provisions. The messenger sent by the king was to serve as guide as far as Sansanding. Protest and anger were alike impossible. Mungo Park could do nothing but follow the orders sent. Before reaching Sansanding, he was present at the harvest of vegetable butter, which is the produce of a tree called shea. "These trees," says the narrative, "grow in great abundance all over this part of Bambara. They are not planted by the natives, but are found growing naturally in the woods, and in clearing land for cultivation, every tree is cut down but the shea. The tree itself very much resembles the American oak. The fruit, from the kernel of which, after it has been dried in the sun, the butter is prepared by boiling in water, has somewhat the appearance of a Spanish olive. The kernel is embedded in a sweet pulp, under a thin green rind, and the butter produced from it, besides the advantages of keeping a whole year without salt, is whiter, firmer, and, to my palate, of a richer flavour than the best butter I ever tasted from cow's milk. It is a chief article of the inland commerce of these districts." Sansanding, a town containing from 8 to 10,000 inhabitants, is a market place much frequented by the Moors, who bring glassware from the Mediterranean forts, which they exchange for gold dust and cotton. Mungo Park was not able to remain at this place, for the importunities of the natives and the perfidious insinuations of the Moors warned him to continue his journey. His horse was so worn out by the fatigue and privation that he felt obliged to embark on the river Djoliba or Niger. At Murzan, a fishing village upon the northern bank of the river, everything combined to induce Park to relinquish his enterprise. The further he advanced to the eastward down the river, the more he placed himself in the power of the Moors. The rainy season had commenced, and it would soon be impossible to travel otherwise than by boat. Mungo Park was now so poor that he could not even hire a boat; he was forced to rely upon public charity. To advance further under these circumstances was not only to risk his life, but to place the results of all his fatigues and efforts in jeopardy. To return to Gambia was scarcely less perilous; to do so he must traverse hundreds of miles on foot through hostile countries. Still the hope of returning home might sustain his courage. "Before leaving Silla," says the traveller, "I thought it incumbent on me to collect from the Moorish and the negro traders all the information I could concerning the further course of the Niger eastwards, and the situation and extent of the kingdoms in its neighbourhood. 2 days' journey eastward of Silla is the town of Djeneh, which is situated on a small island in the river, and is said to contain as many inhabitants as Sego itself, or any other town in Bambara. At a distance of 2 days more, the river widens and forms a considerable lake, called Dibi, or the Dark Lake, concerning the extent of which all I could learn was that, in crossing it from east to west, the canoes lose sight of land for 1 whole day. From this lake the water issues in many different streams, which finally become 2 branches, one flowing to the northeast, the other to the east. But these branches join at Kabra, which is 1 day's journey to the south of Timbuctoo, and is the port or shipping place of that city. The tract of land between the 2 streams is called Timbala, and is inhabited by negroes. The whole distance by land from Djeneh to Timbuctoo is 12 days' journey. Northeast of Masena is the kingdom of Timbuctoo, the great object of European research, the capital of the kingdom being one of the principal marts for the extensive commerce which the Moors carry on with the negroes. The hope of acquiring wealth in this pursuit, and zeal for propagating their religion, have filled this extensive city with Moors. The king himself and all the chief officers of this country are Moors, and are said to be more intolerant and severe in their principles than any other of the Moorish tribes in this part of Africa. Mungo Park was then forced to retrace his steps, and that through a country devastated by inundation and heavy rains. He passed through Murzan, Kea, and Mobidon, where he regained his horse; Niara, Sasanding, Sanea, and Sai, which is surrounded by a deep moat, and protected by high walls with square towers; Jabea, a large town from which he perceived high mountain ranges; and Taffara, where he was received with little hospitality. At the village of Souha, Park begged a handful of grain of a Dooty, who answered that he had nothing to give away. Whilst I was examining the face of this inhospitable old man, and endeavouring to find out the cause of the sullen discontent which was visible in his eye, he called to a slave who was working in the cornfield at a little distance, and ordered him to bring his spade with him. The Dooty then told him to dig a hole in the ground, pointing to a spot at no great distance. The slave with his spade began to dig in the earth, and the Dooty, who appeared to be a man of very fretful disposition, kept muttering to himself until the pit was almost finished, when he repeatedly pronounced the word Ankatod, good for nothing, Jankralemen, a regular plague, which expressions I thought applied to myself. As the pit had very much the appearance of a grave, I thought it prudent to mount my horse, and was about to decamp, when the slave, who had gone before to the village, returned with the corpse of a boy about 9 or 10 years of age, quite naked. The negro carried the body by an arm and leg, and threw it into the pit with a savage indifference which I had never seen. As he covered the body with earth, the Dooty kept repeating Napula attemata, money lost, whence I concluded the boy had been his slave. End of Section 38. Section 39 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 2. African Explorers. C. Mungo Park left Kalikurro, where he had obtained food by writing safis or talismans for the natives, upon the 22nd of August, and reached Bammakoa, where a large salt market is held. From an eminence near the town he perceived a high mountain range in the kingdom of Kong, whose ruler had a more numerous army than the king of Bambara. Once more robbed by brigands of all he possessed, the unfortunate traveller found himself, in the rainy season, alone in a vast desert, 5 leagues from the nearest European settlement, and for the moment gave way to despair. But his courage soon revived, and reaching the town of Sibidulu, his horse and clothes, which had been stolen from him by Fula robbers, were restored to him by the Mansa, or chief. Kamalia, or Karfa Taura, advised him to await the cessation of the rainy season, and then to proceed to Gambia with a caravan of slaves. Worn out, destitute, attacked by fever, which for 5 months kept him prostrate, Mungo Park had no choice but to remain in his place. Upon the 19th of April the caravan set out. We can readily imagine the joy experienced by Mungo Park when all was ready. Crossing the desert of Jalonka, and passing first the principal branch of the Senegal River and then the Faleme, the caravan finally reached the shores of the Gambia, and on the 12th of June, 1797, Mungo Park once more arrived at Pisania, where he was warmly welcomed by Professor Laidley, who had despaired of ever seeing him again. The traveller returned to England upon the 22nd of September. So great was the impatience with which an account of his discoveries, certainly the most important in this part of Africa, was awaited, that the African Society allowed him to publish for his own profit an abridged account of his adventures. He had collected more facts as to geography, manners, and customs of the country than all preceding travellers. He had determined the position of the sources of the Senegal and Gambia, and surveyed the course of the Niger or Joliba, which he proved to run eastwards, whilst the Gambia flowed to the west. Thus a point, which up to this time had been disputed by geographers, was finally settled. It was no longer possible to confound the 3 rivers, as the French geographer Delisle had done in 1707, when he represented the Niger as running eastwards from Bornu and flowing into the river Senegal on the west. He himself, however, had admitted and corrected this error in the later maps of 1722 and 1727, no doubt on account of the facts ascertained by André Brou, governor of Senegal. Houghton, indeed, had learned much from the natives of the course of the Niger through the Mandingo country, and of the relative position of the Sego, Djenne, and Timbuctoo, but it was reserved for Mungo Park to fix positively, from personal knowledge, the position of the two first named towns, and to furnish circumstantial details of the country and the tribes who inhabit it. Public opinion was unanimous as to the importance of the great traveller's exploration, and keenly appreciative of the courage, skill, and honesty exhibited by him. A short time later, the English government offered Mungo Park the conduct of an expedition to the interior of Australia, but he refused it. In 1804, however, the African Society determined to complete the survey of the Niger, and proposed to Mungo Park the command of a new expedition for its exploration. This time the great traveller did not refuse, and upon the 30th of January 1805 he left England. 2 months later he landed at Goree. He was accompanied by his brother-in-law Anderson, a surgeon, by George Scott, a draughtsman, and by 35 artillerymen. He was authorized to enrol as many soldiers as he liked in his service, and was provided with a credit of £500. These resources, says Walcknaer, so vast in comparison with those furnished by the African Society, were, to our thinking, partly the cause of his loss. The rapacious demands of the African kings grew in proportion to the riches they supposed our traveller to possess, and the effort to meet the enormous drain made upon him was in great part the cause of the catastrophe which brought the expedition to an end. 4 carpenters, 1 officer, and 35 artillerymen, and a Mandingo merchant named Isaac, who was to act as guide, with the leaders of the expedition already mentioned, composed an imposing caravan. Mungo Park left Cayy upon the 27th of April, 1805, and reached Pisania the next day. From this place, 10 years earlier, he had started upon his first exploration. Taking an easterly direction, he followed his former route as far as Bambaku, upon the shores of the Niger. When he arrived at this place, the number of Europeans was already reduced to 6 soldiers and a carpenter; the remainder had succumbed to fatigue, or the fevers incidental to the inundations. The exactions of the various petty chiefs through whose domain the expedition passed had considerably diminished the stock of merchandise. Mungo Park was now guilty of an act of grave imprudence. Remarking that trade was very active at Sansanding, a town containing 11,000 inhabitants, and that beads, indigo, antimony, rings, bracelets, and other articles not likely to be spoiled in the transit to England were freely exhibited for sale, he opened, says Walcknaer, a large shop which he stocked with European merchandise, for sale wholesale or retail, and probably the large profits he made excited the envy of the merchants. The natives of Djenné, the Moors, and the merchants of Sansanding joined with those of Sego in offering, in the presence of Modibinne, to give the king of Mansong a larger and more valuable quantity of merchandise than he had received from the English traveller, if he would seize his baggage and then kill him or send him out of Bambara. But in spite of his knowledge of this fact, Mungo Park still kept his shop open, and he received, as the proceeds of one single day's business, 25,756 pieces of money, or cowries. Upon the 28th of October, Anderson expired after 4 months' illness, and Mungo Park found himself once more alone in the heart of Africa. The king of Mansong had accorded him permission to build a boat which would enable him to explore the Niger. Naming his craft the Djoliba, he fixed upon the 16th of November for his departure. Here his journal ends, with details on the riverside populations and on the geography of the countries he was the first to discover. This journal, when it reached Europe, was published, imperfect as it was, as soon as the sad fact was realized that the writer had perished in the waters of the Djoliba. It contained in reality no new discovery, but it was recognized as useful to geographical science. Mungo Park had determined the astronomical position of the more important towns, and thereby furnished material for a map of Senegambia. The perfecting of this map was entrusted to Arrowsmith, who stated in an advertisement that, finding wide differences between the positions of the towns as shown in the journal by each day's travel, and that furnished by the astronomical observations, it was impossible to reconcile them. but that, in accordance with the latter, he had been obliged to place the route followed by Mungo Park in his first voyage further north. It was reserved for the Frenchman Walcknaer to discover a curious discrepancy in Mungo Park's journal. This was a singular error upon the part of the traveller, which neither the English editor nor the French translator, whose work was badly performed, had discovered. Mungo Park, in his diary, records events as happening upon the 31st of April. As everyone knows that that month has only 30 days, it followed that during the course of his journey the traveller had made a mistake of a whole day, reckoning in his calculations from the evening instead of the morning. Hence important rectifications were necessary in Arrowsmith's map, but none the less, when once Mungo Park's error is recognized, it is evident that to him we owe the first faithful map of Senegambia. Although the facts that reached the English government allowed no room for doubt as to the fate of the traveller, a rumour that white men had been seen in the interior of Africa induced the governor of Senegal to fit out an expedition. The command was entrusted to the negro merchant Isaac, Mungo Park's guide, who had faithfully delivered the traveller's journal to the English authorities. We need not linger over the account of this expedition, but merely relate that which relates the last days of Mungo Park. At Sansanding, Isaac encountered Amadi Fatouma, the native who was with Park on the Djoliba when he perished, and from him he obtained the following recital: "We embarked at Sansanding, and in 2 days reached Silla, the spot where Mungo Park completed his first journey. After 2 days' navigation we reached Djenne. In passing Dibi, 3 boats filled with negroes armed with lances and arrows, but without firearms, approached us. We had passed successively Ragbara and Timbuctoo, when we were pursued by these boats, which we repulsed with difficulty, and only after killing several natives. At Guruma we were attacked by 7 boats, but succeeded in repulsing them. Constant skirmishes ensued, with heavy loss to the blacks, until we reached Kaffo, where we remained for a day. We then proceeded down the river as far as Karmuz, and anchored off Gournou. Next day we perceived a Moorish detachment, who allowed us to pass. We then entered the country of Hausa. Next day we reached Yaouri, and sent Amadi Fatouma into the town, with presents for the chief and to purchase food. The negro, before accepting the presents, inquired if the white traveller intended to revisit his country. Mungo Park, to whom the question was reported, replied that he should never return. It is supposed that these words brought about his death. The negro chief, once convinced that he should not see Mungo Park again, determined to keep the presents intended for his king. Meantime Amadi Fatouma reached the king's residence, at some distance from the river. The prince, warned by the presence of the white men, sent an army next day to the small village of Boussa, on the river side. When the Djoliba appeared, it was assailed by a shower of stones and arrows. Park threw his baggage into the river, and jumped in with his companions. All perished. Thus miserably died the first Englishman who had navigated the Djoliba and visited Timbuctoo. Many efforts were made in the same direction, but almost all were destined to fail. At the end of the 18th century, 2 of Linnaeus's best pupils explored the south of Africa in the interest of natural history. Sparrman undertook the search for animals, and Thunberg for plants. The account of Sparrman's expedition, which, as we have said, was interrupted by his voyage in Oceania after Cook's expedition, was the first to appear. It was translated into French by La Tournelle. In the preface, which is still allowed to stand, La Tournelle deplored the loss of the learned explorer, who he said had died during a voyage to the Gold Coast. Just as the work was published, Sparrman reappeared, to the great astonishment of La Tournelle. Sparrman had reached Africa upon the 30th of April, 1772, and landed at the Cape of Good Hope. At this time the town was only 2 miles across each way, including the gardens and plantations adjoining it on one side. The streets were wide, planted with oaks, and the houses were white, or, to Sparrman's surprise, painted green. His object in visiting the Cape was to act as tutor to the children of M. Kerste, but upon his arrival in Cape Town he found that his employer was absent at his winter residence in False Bay. When the spring came round, Sparrman accompanied Kerste to Alpen, a property which he possessed near Constance. The naturalist availed himself of the opportunity to make many excursions in the neighbourhood, and attempt the somewhat dangerous ascent of the Table Mountain. By these means he became acquainted with the manners and customs of the Boers, and their treatment of their slaves. The violence of the latter was so great that the inhabitants of the town were obliged to sleep with locked doors, and provided with firearms close at hand. Nearly all over the colony a rough hospitality ensured a certain welcome for the traveller. Sparrman relates several curious experiences of his own. "I arrived one evening," he says, "at the dwelling of a farmer named Van der Spooy, a widower born in Africa, and father of the proprietor of the Red Constance, or the Old Constance. Making believe not to see me approach, he remained stationary in the entry of his house. As I approached him, he offered his hand, still without attempting to come forward, and said, 'Good day, you're welcome. How are you? Who are you? A glass of wine, perhaps? Or a pipe? Will you partake of something?' I answered his questions laconically, and accepted his offers in the same style as they were offered. His daughter, a well-made girl of some 14 or 15 years of age, brought in dinner, which consisted of a fine breast of lamb, stewed with carrots. The meal over, she offered me tea so pleasantly that I was quite puzzled whether to admire the dinner or my charming hostess the most. Both father and daughter showed the greatest kindness and good will. I spoke to my host several times, in hope of breaking his silence, but his replies were brief, and I observed that he only once commenced a conversation himself, when he pressed me to remain over night in his house. I bid him farewell, deeply impressed with his hospitality." Sparrman undertook several similar expeditions, among others one to Hood Bay and Paarl, in which he had frequent occasion to notice the exaggerations to be met with in the narrative of Kolbe, his predecessor. He intended to continue his explorations during the winter, and projected a journey into the interior when the fine season should return. When the frigates commanded by Captain Cook, the Resolution and Adventure, arrived at the Cape, Forster invited the young Swedish naturalist to accompany him, and Sparrman was thus enabled to visit New Zealand, Van Diemen's Land, New Holland, Otaheite, Tierra del Fuego, the Antarctic regions, and New Georgia, before his return to the Cape, where he landed on the 22nd of March, 1775. His first care upon his return was to organize his expedition to the interior, and in order to add to his available resources he practiced medicine and surgery during the winter. A cargo of corn, medicine, knives, tinder boxes, and spirits for the preservation of specimens was collected, and packed in an immense waggon drawn by 5 yoke of oxen. Sparrman says, "The conductor of this cart needs dexterity not only in his management of the animals, but in the use of the whip of African drivers. These instruments are about 15 feet long, with a thong of the same or greater length, and a tongue of white leather almost 3 feet long. The driver holds this formidable instrument in both hands, and from his seat in front of the waggon can reach the foremost oxen with it. He distributes his cuts unceasingly, well understanding how and where to distribute them in such a manner that the hide of the animals feels the whip." Sparrman was to accompany the waggon on horseback, and was accompanied by a young colonist named Immelman, who wished to penetrate into the interior for recreation. They started upon the 25th of July, 1775. After passing Rent River, scaling the Hottentot Holland Kloof, and crossing the Palmite, they entered a desert country, interspersed with plains, mountains, and valleys, without water, but frequented by antelopes of various kinds, with zebras and ostriches. Sparrman soon reached the warm mineral baths at the foot of the Zwartberg, which at that time were much frequented, the company having built a house near the mountains. At this point the explorer was joined by young Immelman, and together they started for Zwellendam, which they reached upon the 2nd of September. We will give a few of the facts they collected about the inhabitants. The Hottentots are as tall as Europeans, their hands and feet are small, and their color a brownish yellow. They have not the thick lips of the Kaffirs and natives of Mozambique. Their hair is black and woolly, curly, but not thick. They rub the entire body with fat and soot. A Hottentot who paints himself looks less naked and more complete, so to say, than one who only rubs himself with grease. Hence the saying, "A Hottentot without paint is like a shoe without blacking." These natives usually wear a cloak called karos, made of sheep's skin with the wool turned inwards. The women arrange it with a long point, which forms a sort of hood, in which they place their children. Both men and women wear leather rings upon their arms and legs, a custom which gave rise to the fable that this race rolled puddings round their limbs to feed on from time to time. They also wear copper and iron rings, but these ornaments are less common. The kraal, or Hottentot village, is a collection of huts in a circle, all very similar and of the shape of beehives. The doors, which are in the centre, are so low that they can only be entered on the knees. The hearth is in the middle of the hut, and the roof has no hole for the escape of the smoke. The Hottentots must not be confounded with the Bushmen. The latter live only for hunting and robbery. Their skill in throwing poisoned arrows, their courage, and the wildness of their lives render them invincible. At Zwellendam, Sparrman saw the quagga, a species of horse like a zebra in shape, but with shorter ears. End of section 39. Section 40 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century. By Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 2. African Explorers. D. The explorer next visited Mossel Bay, a harbor little used as it is too much exposed to the west winds, and thence he proceeded to the country of the Houtniquas, or, as Burchell's map calls them, the Antinikas. This woody country appeared fertile, and the colonists established there are prosperous. Sparrman met with most of the quadrupeds of Africa in this district, such as elephants, leopards, lions, tiger cats, hyenas, monkeys, hares, antelopes, and gazelles. We will not attempt to follow Sparrman to all the small settlements he visited. An enumeration of the streams, kraals, or villages he passed would convey no information to the reader. Rather, let us gather from his narratives a few curious and novel details concerning two creatures which he describes, the sheep of the Cape and the honey guide. When a sheep is to be killed, he says, the very leanest of the flock is selected. It would be impossible to use the others for food. Their tails are of a triangular shape, and are often a foot and a half long, and occasionally 6 inches thick in the upper part. One of these tails will weigh 8 or 12 pounds, and they consist principally of delicate fat, which some persons eat with bread instead of butter. It is used in the preparation of food, and sometimes to make candles. After describing the two-horned rhinoceros, hitherto unknown, the gnu, an animal in form something between the horse and the ox, the gazelle, the baboon, and the hippopotamus, the habits of which were previously imperfectly known, Sparrman describes a curious bird of great service to the natives, which he calls the honey guide. This bird, he says, is remarkable neither in size nor color. At first sight it would be taken for a common sparrow, but it is a little larger than that bird, of a somewhat lighter color, with a small yellow spot on each shoulder, and dashes of white in the wings and tail. In its own interests, this bird leads the natives to the bees' nests, for it is very fond of honey, and it knows that whenever a nest is destroyed, a little honey will be spilt, or left behind, as a recompense for its services. It seems to grow hungry in the morning and evening. In any case, it is then that it leaves its nest, and by its piercing cries attracts the attention of the Hottentots, or the colonists. The cries are almost always answered by the appearance of natives or settlers, when the bird, repeating its call unceasingly, slowly flies from place to place towards the spot where the bees have made their home. Arrived at the nest, whether it be in the cleft of a rock, in a hollow tree, or in some underground cavity, the guide hovers about it for a few seconds, and then perches hard by, and remains a silent and hidden spectator of the pillage, in which he hopes subsequently to have its share. Of this phenomenon I have myself twice been a witness. On the 12th of April, 1776, on his way back to the Cape, Sparrman heard that a large lake, the only one in this colony, had been discovered, to the north of the Schneuwberg district. A little later the traveller got back to the Cape, and embarked for Europe with the numerous natural history collections he had made. About the same time, between 1772 1775, Thunberg, the Swede whom Sparrman had met at the Cape, made 3 successive journeys in the interior of Africa. They were not, any more than Sparrman's, actual journeys of discovery, and we owe the acquisition of no new geographical fact to Thunberg. He did but make a vast number of interesting observations on the birds of the Cape, and he also ascertained a few interesting details respecting the various races of the interior, which turned out to be far more fertile than was at first supposed. Thunberg was followed in the same latitudes by an English officer, Lieutenant William Patterson, whose chief aim was to collect plants and other objects of natural history. He penetrated a little further north than the Orange River, and into Kaffraria a good deal farther east than Fish River. To him we owe the first notice of the giraffe, and his narrative is rich in important observations on the natural history, structure, and inhabitants of the country. It is a curious fact that the Europeans attracted to South Africa by zeal for geographical discovery were far less numerous than those whose motive was love of natural history. We have already mentioned Sparrman, Thunberg, and Patterson. To this list we must now add the name of the ornithologist Le Vaillant. Born at Paramaribo, in Dutch Guiana, of French parents who traded in birds, Le Vaillant visited Europe with them as a mere child, and traversed Holland, Germany, Lorraine, and the Vosges on his way to Paris. It will readily be understood that this wandering life awoke in him a taste for travelling, and his passion for birds, early excited by the examination of private and public collections, made him eager to enrich science by descriptions and drawings of unknown species. Now, what country would afford the richest ornithological harvest? The districts near the Cape had been explored by botanists, and by a scientific man who had made quadrupeds his chief study, but no one had as yet traversed them to collect birds. Le Vaillant arrived at the Cape on the 29th of March, 1781, after the loss of his vessel in an explosion, with nothing but the clothes he wore, 10 ducats, and his gun. Others would have been disheartened, but Le Vaillant did not despair of extricating himself from his painful position. Confident in his skill with the gun and the bow, in his strength and agility, as well as in his skill in preparing the skins of animals, and in stuffing birds so that their plumage should retain all their natural gloss, the naturalist had soon opened relations with the wealthiest collectors of the Cape. One of these, an official named Bourse, provided Le Vaillant with every requisite for a successful journey, including carts, oxen, provisions, objects for barter, and horses. Even servants and guides were appointed free of cost to the explorer. The kind of researches to which Le Vaillant intended to devote himself influenced his mode of travelling. Instead of seeking frequented and beaten tracks, he tried to avoid them, and to penetrate into districts neglected by Europeans, hoping in them to meet with birds unknown to science. As a result, he may be said always to have taken nature by surprise, coming in contact with natives whose manners had not yet been modified by intercourse with whites, so that the information he gives us brings savage life as it really is more vividly before us than anything told us by his predecessors or successors. The only mistake made by Le Vaillant was the entrusting of the translation of his notes to a young man who modified them to suit his own notions. Far from taking the scrupulous care to be exact, which distinguishes modern editors, he exaggerated facts, and dwelling too much on the personal qualities of the traveller, he gave to the narrative of the journey a boastful tone very prejudicial to it. After 3 months' stay at the Cape and in its neighbourhood, Le Vaillant started, on the 18th of December, 1781, for the first journey eastwards, and in Kaffraria. His equipment this time consisted of 30 oxen, 10 for each of his 2 wagons, and 10 as reserve, 3 horses, 9 dogs, and 5 Hottentots. Le Vaillant first crossed the Dutch districts already explored by Sparrman, where he met with vast herds of zebras, antelopes, and ostriches, arriving in due course at Zwellendam, where he bought some oxen, a cart, and a cock, the last serving as an alarm clock throughout the journey. Another animal was also of great use to him. This was a monkey he had tamed, and promoted to the post, alike useful and honourable, of taster, no one being allowed to touch any fruit or root unknown to the Hottentots until Master Rees had given his verdict upon it. Rees was also employed as a sentinel, and his senses, sharpened by use and the struggle for life, exceeded in delicacy those of the most subtle redskin. He it was who warned the dogs of the approach of danger. If a snake approached, or a troop of monkeys were disporting themselves in the neighbouring thicket, Rees's terror and his shrieks quickly revealed the presence of a disturbing element. From Zwellendam, which he left on the 12th of January, 1782, Le Vaillant made his way eastwards, at some little distance from the sea. He pitched his camp on the banks of the Columbia (Duiwen Hock) river, and made many very successful hunting excursions in a district rich in game, finally reaching Mossel Bay, where the howls of innumerable hyenas frightened the oxen. A little farther on he entered the country of the Houtniquas, a Hottentot name signifying men filled with honey. Here not a step could be taken without coming upon swarms of bees. Flowers sprang up beneath the feet of the travellers, the air was heavy with their perfume. Their varied colours lent such enchantment to the scene that some of the servants would have liked to halt. Le Vaillant, however, hastened to press on. The whole of this district, down to the sea, is occupied by colonists, who breed cattle, make butter, cultivate timber, and collect honey, sending their merchandise to the Cape for sale. A little beyond the last post of the company, Le Vaillant, having entered a district peopled by thousands of turacos and other rare birds, pitched his hunting camp, but his plans were terribly upset by the continuous fall of heavy rains, the result of which was to reduce the travellers to great straits for want of food. After many a sudden change of fortune, and many hunting adventures, an account of which would be very amusing, though beyond the scope of our narrative, Le Vaillant reached Mossel Bay. Here, with what delight we can easily imagine, he found letters from France awaiting him. One excursion after another was now made in various directions, until Kaffraria was entered. It was difficult to open relations with its people, who sedulously avoided the whites, having suffered the loss of many men and much cattle at their hands. Moreover, the Tambukis had taken advantage of their critical position to invade Kaffraria and commit numerous depredations, whilst the Bosjemans hunted them down unmercifully. Without firearms, and attacked on so many sides at once, the Kaffirs were driven to hiding themselves, and were retiring northwards. As matters stood, it was useless to attempt to penetrate into the mountainous districts of Kaffraria, and Le Vaillant retraced his steps. He then visited the Schneuwberg Mountains, the Karoo Desert, and the shores of the Buffalo River, returning to the Cape on the 2nd of April, 1783. The results of this long campaign were important. Le Vaillant obtained some decided information about the Gonaquas, a numerous race which must not be confounded with the Hottentots properly so called, but are probably the offspring of their intermarriage with the Kaffirs. With regard to the Hottentots themselves, the information collected by Le Vaillant agrees on almost every point with that obtained by Sparrman. The Kaffirs seen by Le Vaillant, said Walcknaer, were most of them taller than either the Hottentots or the Gonaquas. They have neither the retiring jaws nor prominent cheek bones which are so repulsive in the Hottentots, but are less noticeable in the Gonaquas, Neither have they the broad flat faces or thick lips of their neighbors the negroes of Mozambique. Their faces, on the contrary, are round, their noses fairly prominent, and their teeth the whitest and most regular of any people in the world. Their complexion is of a clear dark brown, and but for this one characteristic, says Le Vaillant, any Kaffir woman would be considered very pretty even beside a European. During Le Vaillant's 16 months of absence, the aspect of the Cape had completely changed. When the traveller left, he admired the modest bearing of the Dutch women; on his return, he found them thinking only of amusement and dress. Ostrich feathers were so much in vogue that they had to be imported from Europe and Asia. All those brought by our traveller were quickly bought up. The birds which he had sent to the colony on every possible opportunity now amounted to 1024 specimens, and Mr. Burr's house, where they were kept, were converted into a regular natural history museum. Le Vaillant's journey had been so successful that he could not but wish to begin another. Although his friend Burrs had returned to Europe, he was able, with the aid of the many other friends he had made, to collect the materials for a fresh trip. On the 15th of June, 1783, he started at the head of a caravan numbering 19 persons. He also took 13 dogs, 1 he and 2 she goats, 3 cows, 36 draught and 14 reserve oxen, with 2 for carrying the baggage of the Hottentot servants. We shall not, of course, follow the traveller in his hunting excursions. All we need to know is that he succeeded in making a collection of marvellous birds, that he introduced the first giraffe to Europe, and that he traversed the whole of the vast space between the Tropic of Capricorn, on the west, and the 14th meridian on the east. He returned to the Cape in 1784. He embarked for Europe, and arrived at Paris early in January 1785. The first native people met with by Le Vaillant in his second voyage were the little Namakas, a race but very little known, and who soon died out, the more readily that they occupied a barren country, subject to constant attacks from the Bosjemans. Although of fair height, they are inferior in appearance to the Kaffirs and Namaquas, to whose customs theirs bear a great resemblance. The Kaminoquas, or Komeinakwas, of whom Le Vaillant gives many particulars, exceed them in height. He says, "They appear taller even than the Gonaqwas, although possibly they are not so in reality, but the illusion is sustained by their small bones, delicate and emaciated appearance, and slender limbs. The long mantle of light material which hangs from the shoulder to the ground adds to their height. They look like drawn-out men. Lighter in color than the Cape natives, they have better features than the other Hottentot tribes, owing to the fact that their noses are less flat and their cheek bones less prominent." Of all the races visited by Le Vaillant, the most peculiar and most ancient was that of the Huzonanas, a tribe which had not been met with by any other northern traveller, but they appear identical with the Bechuanas, although the part of the country assigned to them does not coincide with that which they are known to have occupied for many years. The Huzonanas, says the narrative, are small in stature, the tallest being scarcely 5 feet 4 in height. These small beings are perfectly proportioned, and are surprisingly strong and active. They have an imposing air of boldness. Le Vaillant considers them the best endowed mentally, and the strongest physically, of all the savage races he had met with. In face they resemble the Hottentots, but they have rounded chins, and they are far less black. They have curly hair, so short that Le Vaillant at first imagined it to be shaven. One striking peculiarity of the Huzonanas is a large mass of flesh upon the back of the women, which forms a natural saddle, and oscillates strangely with every movement of the body. Le Vaillant describes a woman whom he saw with her child, about 3 years old, who was perched upon his feet behind her, like a footman behind a cabriolet. We will pass over the traveller's description of the appearance and customs of these various races, many of which are now extinct, or incorporated in some more powerful tribe. Although by no means the least curious portion of his narrative, the details are so exaggerated that we prefer to omit them. Upon the eastern coast of Africa, a Portuguese traveller, named Francisco José de la Cerda y Almeida, left Mozambique in 1797 to explore the interior. The account of this expedition to a place which has only lately been revisited would be of great interest, but unfortunately, so far as we know, his journal has not been published. His name is often quoted by geographers, and they appear to know what countries he visited, but in France, at least, no lengthened notice of this geographer exists, which would furnish the details of his exploration. A very few words will convey all that we have been able to collect of the history of a man who has made most important discoveries, and whose name has most unfairly been forgotten. Lacerda, the date and place of whose birth are unknown, was an engineer, and he was professionally engaged in settling the boundary of the frontier between the Spanish and Portuguese possessions in South America. Whilst thus employed, he collected a mass of interesting particulars of the province of Mato Grosso, which are given in the Revista Trimensal do Brasil. We cannot tell what circumstances led him, after this successful expedition, to the Portuguese possessions in Africa, nor is it easy to imagine his motives for crossing South Africa from the eastern shore to the kingdom of Loanda. It is, however, certain that he left the well-known town of Tete in 1797 in command of an important caravan bound for the state of Cazembe. This country was governed by a king as renowned for his benevolence and humanity as for his bravery. He inhabited a town called Lunda, which was 2 miles in extent, and situated upon the eastern shore of the lake called Mofo. It would have been interesting to compare these localities with those that we know of in the same parallels today. But the lack of details obliges us to desist, merely observing that the word Lunda was well known to Portuguese travellers. As regards Cazembe, there is no longer any question as to its position. Well received by the king, Lacerda remained some 20 days with him, and then proceeded upon his journey. Unfortunately, when a day or two's march from Lunda, he succumbed to fatigue and the unhealthiness of the climate. The native king collected the traveller's notes and journals, and ordered them to be sent with his remains to Mozambique, but unfortunately the caravan entrusted with these precious memorials was attacked, and the remains of the unfortunate Lacerda were left in the heart of Africa. His notes were brought to Europe by a nephew who had accompanied the expedition. End of Section 40.